Chapter 19, Tenebrae. The resigned composure with which I accepted Thorndyke's sentence of confinement within doors was not entirely attributable to discretion or native virtue. My resolution to follow scrupulously my principal's very pointed advice was somewhat like the ascetic resolutions formed by the gourmet as he rises replete from the banquet table. For, just as the latter is in a peculiarly favorable condition for the unmoved contemplation of a temporary abstinence from food, so I, having enjoyed my little dissipation, could now contemplate with fortitude a brief period of retirement. Moreover, the weather was in my favor, being as Polton reported, when he returned, blue-nosed and powdered with snow, with a fresh supply of tobacco for me bitterly cold, with a threatening of smoky fog from the east. Under these circumstances, it was no great hardship to sit in a roomy armchair with my slippered feet on the curb and read and meditate as I basked in the warmth of a glowing fire. Though, to be sure, my reading was perfunctory enough, for the treatise of the surface markings of the human body, admirable as it was, competed on very unfavorable terms with other claimants to my attention. In truth, I had plenty to think about even if I went no farther for matter than to the events of the previous day. There was my visit to Sylvia, for instance. I had not said much to her, but what I had said had pledged me to a lifelong companionship, which was a solemn thing to reflect upon even though I looked forward to the fulfillment of that pledge with nothing but hopeful pleasure. The dice were thrown. Of course they would turn up sixes, everyone, but still the dice were thrown. From my own strictly personal affairs, my thoughts rambled by an easy transition to the singular episode of the buried portrait, and thence to the subject of that strange palimpsest. Viewed by the light of Mr. O'Donnell's revelations, Mrs. Samway's position was not all that could have been desired. She and her husband had unquestionably been closely associated with Maddock, but Maddock was, it seemed, a habitual criminal. Could this fact have been known to the Samways? Or was it that the cunning forger and swindler had sheltered himself behind their respectability? It was impossible for me to say. Then there was the strange and perplexing case of the man Maddock himself. I could make nothing of that, had not indeed been aware that there had been a case, until Thorndyke's investigations had put me in possession of the fact. And even now I could see nothing on which to base any suspicion, apart from the attempts on my life, which we were assuming to be in some way connected with events that had occurred in Maddock's house. The cause of death was apparently not morbus cordis, which might easily enough be, seeing that the diagnosis of heart disease was a mere guess on Batson's part. But if not morbus cordis, what was it? Thorndyke apparently knew, and seemed to hint that it was something other than ordinary disease. Could there have been foul play? And if so, were the Samways involved in it in any way? It seemed incredible, for had not Maddock himself suspected that he was in a dangerous state of health? There was certainly one possibility which I considered with a good deal of distaste, namely, that Maddock had been in a hypochondriacal state, and that the Samways had taken advantage of his gloomy views as to his health to administer poison. The thing was actually possible, but I did not entertain it, for, even if one assumed that poison had been administered, at any rate, the cremation of the body was not designed to hide the traces of the crime. The Samways had nothing to do with that. The cremation had been adopted in preference to burial by Maddock's own wish. So my thoughts flitted from topic to topic, with occasional interludes of surface markings, through the lazy forenoon until Polton came to lay my solitary luncheon. And after this little break in the comfortable monotony, another spell of meditative idleness set in. Polton was busy upstairs in the laboratory with some photographic copying operations, and I was disposed to wander up and look on. But my small friend politely but very firmly vetoed any such proceeding. On some other occasion he would be delighted to show me the working of the great copying camera, but just now he had a big job in hand, and, as he was working against time, he would prefer to be alone. He even suggested that I might attend to any stray callers and make my own tea on the gas ring so as to avoid interrupting his work. And when I had agreed to relieve him to this extent, he thanked me profusely and retired, and I saw no more of him. For some time after his departure, I stood at the window looking out across the wide space at Paper Buildings and the end of Crown Office Row. It was a wretched afternoon. The yellow, turbid sky brooded close upon the house roofs and grew darker and more brown moment by moment, as if the invisible sun had given the day up in despair and gone home early. A comfortless powdering of snow filtered down at intervals and melted on the pavements, along which depressed wayfarers hurried with their coat collars turned up and their hands thrust deep into their pockets. I watched them commiseratingly, reflecting on the superior advantages of being within doors and forbidden to go out. And then, having flung another scoopful of coal on the fire, I betook myself once more to the armchair, the surface markings, and idle meditation. It was some time past 4 when my reflective browsings had begun to proceed in the direction of the tea kettle, that I heard a light footstep on the landing as of someone wearing galoshes. Then a letter dropped softly into the box, and, as I instantly pushed back my chair to rise, the footsteps retreated. I crossed the room quickly and opened the door. But the messenger had already disappeared down the dark staircase, and had gone so silently on his rubber soles that though I listened attentively, I could hear no sound from below. Having closed the door, I extracted the letter from the box and took it over to the window to examine it, when I was not a little surprised to find that it was addressed to W.M. Howard. Esquire. This was the first communication that I had received in my borrowed name, and my surprise at its arrival was not unreasonable, for, of the few persons who knew me by that name, none with the exception, perhaps, of Mr. Marchmont was, in the least likely to write to me. But if the address on the envelope had surprised me, the letter itself surprised me a good deal more. For though the writer was quite unknown to me, even by name, he seemed to be in possession of certain information concerning me which I had supposed to be the exclusive property of Thorndyke, Jervis, Polton, and myself. It bore the address 29 Fig Tree Court, Inner Temple, and ran thus: Dear Sir, I am taking the liberty of writing to you to ask for your assistance, as I happen to know that my friends, Doctors Thorndyke and Jervis, are away at Maidstone and not available at the moment, and I understand that you have some acquaintance with medical technicalities. The circumstances are these. At 5:30 today, I shall be meeting a solicitor to advise as to action in respect of a case in which I am retained, and the decision as to our action will be vitally affected by a cert issue on which I am not competent to form an opinion for lack of medical knowledge. If Dr. Thorndyke had been within reach, I should have taken his opinion. As he is not, it occurred to me to ask if you would fill his place on this occasion, it being, of course, understood that the usual fee of 5 guineas will be paid by the solicitor. If you should be unable to come to the consultation, do not trouble to reply, as I am now going out and shall not be returning until 5:30, the time of the appointment. I am, Yours faithfully, Arthur Courtland. The contents of this letter, as I have said, surprised me more than a little. How, in the name of all that was wonderful, had this stranger, whose very name was unknown to me, come to be aware that I had any knowledge of medicine? Not from Thorndyke, I felt perfectly sure, nor from Jervis, who, notwithstanding a certain flippant facetiousness of manner, was really an extremely cautious and judicious man. Could it be that my principal was overseen in his trusted laboratory assistant? Was it conceivable that the suave and discreet Polton had moments of leakiness, when, in unofficial talk outside, he let drop the secrets of which his employer's unbounded confidence had made him the repository? I could not believe it. Not only did Polton appear to be the very soul of discretion, there was Thorndyke himself. He was not the man to give his confidence to anyone until after the most exhaustive proof of the safety of so giving it. Nor was he a man who was likely to be deceived, for nothing escaped his observation, and nothing that he observed was passed over without careful consideration. My lethargy having been shaken off, I addressed myself to the task of preparing tea, and, as I listened to the homely crescendo of the kettle's song, I turned the matter over in all its bearings. By some means, this Mr. Courtland had become aware that I was either a doctor or a medical student. But by what means? Was it possible that he had merely inferred from the circumstance of my being associated with Thorndyke that I was of the same profession? That was just barely conceivable. But if he had then, as Jervis had said of Father Humperdinck, he must be a devil at guessing. As I made the tea and subsequently consumed it, I continued to ruminate on the contents of that singular letter. No answer to it was required. Then what was Mr. Courtland going to do if I did not turn up? He admitted that the issue, which seemed to be an important one, was beyond him, and yet he had to give an answer to the solicitor. And he was prepared to pay 5 guineas for the advice of a man of whom he presumably knew nothing. That was odd. In fact, the whole tone of the letter, with its inconsistent mixture of urgency and casual trusting to chance, seemed irreconcilable with the care and method that one expects from a professional man. And there was another point. The time of the consultation was 5:30. Now, within an hour of that time, Thorndyke would be back, or even sooner if he came by the earlier train, as he had done on the previous day, as Mr. Cortland must have known, since he knew whither my principal had gone, and he must have often attended assizes himself. Could he not have waited an hour? And again, had this business been sprung upon him so suddenly that he had had no time to get Thorndyke's opinion? And yet again, why had he written at all, instead of dropping in at our chambers with the solicitor, as was so commonly done by Thorndyke's clients? All of which were curious and puzzling questions which I put to myself, one by one, and had to dismiss unanswered. And then I came to the practical question, to which I had to find an answer, and which was, could I, under the existing circumstances, accede to Mr. Cortland's request? To go outside the precincts of the inn was, I recognized, absolutely forbidden, but I had given no actual promise to remain in our chambers, nor had I been positively forbidden to leave them. Thorndyke had advised me to remain indoors, and his advice had been given so pointedly, and with so evident a desire that it should be followed, that I had not hitherto even thought of leaving our premises. But this was an unforeseen contingency, and the question was, did it alter my position in regard to Thorndyke's advice? I think I have never been so undecided in my life. On the one hand, I was strongly tempted to keep the appointment. The prospect of triumphantly handing to Thorndyke a 5-guinea fee which I had earned as his deputy appealed to me with almost irresistible force. On the other hand, my knowledge of Thorndyke did not support this appeal. I knew him to be a man to whom a principle was much more important than any chance benefit gained by its abandonment, and my inner consciousness told me that he would be better pleased by a strict adherence to our understanding than by the increment of 5 guineas. So my thoughts oscillated to and fro, now impelling me to risk it and earn the fee, and now urging me to keep to the letter of my instructions. And meanwhile, the time ran on and the hour of the consultation approached. What decision I should have reached in the end, it is impossible to say. As matters turned out, I never reached any decision at all, for just as the Treasury clock struck 5:15, I heard a light, quick step on our landing, and immediately after a soft but hurried knock at the door. I strode quickly across the room and threw the door open, and then I started back with an exclamation of astonishment, for the visitor who stood full in the light of the landing lamp was a woman, and the woman was Mrs. Samway. As I stood gazing at her in amazement, she slipped past me into the room and softly shut the door. And then I saw very plainly that there was something amiss, for she was as pale as death, and had a dreadful, frightened, hunted look which haunts me even now as I write. She was somewhat disheveled, too, and though it was a bitter evening, her plump, shapely hands were ungloved and cold as ice, as I noted when I took them in mine. "Are you alone?" she asked, peering uneasily at the door of the little office. "Yes, quite alone," I replied. She gazed at me with those strange, penetrating eyes of hers, and said in a half-whisper, "How strange you look with that beard. I should hardly have known you if I had not expected." She stopped short, and casting a strange, scared glance over her shoulder at the dark windows, whispered, "Can they see in? Can anyone see us from outside?" "I shouldn't think so," I replied, but nevertheless I stepped over to the windows and drew the curtains. "That looks more comfortable at any rate," said I, "and now tell me how in the name of wonder you knew I was here." She grasped both my wrists and looked earnestly, almost fiercely, into my eyes. "Ask me no questions," she exclaimed. "Ask me nothing, but listen. I have come here for a purpose. Has a letter been left here for you?" "Yes," I replied. "Asking you to go to a place in Fig Tree Court." "Good God," I exclaimed, "how on earth?" She shook my wrists impatiently in her strong grasp. "Answer me," she exclaimed. "Answer me." "Yes," I replied. "I was to go there at 5:30. Again her strong grasp tightened on my wrists. "Humphrey," she said in a low, earnest voice, "you are not to go. Do you hear me? You are not to go." And then, as I seemed to hesitate, she continued more urgently. I ask you, I beg you to promise me that you won't. I gazed at her in sheer amazement. But some instinct, some faint glimmer of understanding, restrained me from asking for any explanation. Very well, I said. I won't go if you say I'm not to. That is a promise. Yes, it's a promise. Besides, it's nearly past already, so if I don't go now, the appointment falls through. And you won't go outside these rooms tonight. Promise me that too. If I don't go to this lawyer, I shan't go out at all. And tomorrow, too. Give me your word that you won't let any sort of pretext draw you out of these rooms tomorrow, or the next day, or, in fact, until Dr. Thorndyke says you may. For a few moments I was literally struck dumb with astonishment at her last words, and could do nothing but gaze at her in astounded silence. At length, recovering myself a little, I exclaimed, "My dear Mrs. Samway," but she interrupted me. "Don't call me by that horrible name. Give me my own name, Letitia, or," she added, a little shyly and in a soft, coaxing tone, "call me Letty. Won't you, Humphrey, just for this once? You needn't mind. You wouldn't if you knew. I should like, when I think of my friend, the only friend that I care for, to remember that he called me by my own name when he said goodbye. You'll think me silly and sentimental, but you needn't mind indulging me just once. It's the last time." "The last time," I repeated. "What do you mean by that, Letty, and by speaking of our saying goodbye? Are you going away?" "Yes, I am going away. I don't suppose you will ever see me again. I am going out of your life." "Not out of my life, Letty. We are always friends, even if we never see one another." "Are we?" she said, looking up at me earnestly. "Perhaps it is so, but still this is goodbye. I ought to say it and go, but oh God," she exclaimed with sudden passion, "I don't want to go away from you, Humphrey, out into the cold and the dark." She buried her face against my shoulder, and I could feel that she was sobbing, though she uttered no sound. It was a dreadful situation. Instinctively certain though I was that her grief had a real and tragic basis, I could offer no word of comfort. For what was there to say? She was going, clearly, to a life of wretchedness without hope of any relief or change, and without a single friend to cheer her loneliness. That much I could guess, vaguely and dimly. But it was enough, and it wrung my heart to witness her passion of grief and to be able to offer no more than a pressure of the hand. After a few seconds, she raised her head and looked in my face, with the tears still clinging to her lashes. "Humphrey," she said, laying her hands on my shoulders, "I have a few last words to say to you, and then I must go. Listen to me, dearest friend, and remember what I say. When I am gone, people will tell you things and you will come to know others. People will say that I am a wicked woman, which is true enough, God knows. But if they say that I have done or connived at wickedness against you, try to believe that it was not as it seemed, and to forgive me for what I have done amiss. And say to yourself, this wicked woman would have willingly given her heart's blood for me. Say that, Humphrey. It is true. I would gladly give my life to make you safe and happy, and try to think kindly of me in the evil report that will reach you sooner or later. Will you try, Humphrey?" "My dear Letty," I said, "we are friends now and always. Nothing that I hear shall alter that." "I believe you," she said, "and I thank you from my heart. And now I must go, and it's goodbye, Humphrey, for the very last time." She passed her arms around my neck and pressed her wet cheek to mine. Then she kissed me and, turning away abruptly, walked across to the door and opened it. On the landing, in the light of the lamp, she turned once more, and I saw that the hot blush that had risen to her cheek as she kissed me had faded already into a deathly pallor, and that the dreadful, frightened, hunted look had come back into her face. She stood for a moment with her finger raised warningly and whispered, "Goodbye, dear, goodbye. Shut the door now and shut it quietly." And then she passed into the opening of the dark staircase. I closed the door softly and turned away towards the window, and, as I did so, I heard her stumble slightly on the stair a short way down and utter a little startled cry. I was nearly going out to her, and did, in fact, stand a moment or two listening. But, as I heard nothing more, I moved over to the window and, drawing back the curtain, looked down on our doorstep to see her go out. My mind was in a whirl of confused emotions. Profound pity for this lonely, unhappy, warm-hearted woman contended with amazement at the revelation of her manifest connection with the mystery that surrounded me. And I stood bewildered by the tumult of incoherent thought, grasping the curtain and looking down on the great square stone that I might, at least, catch a farewell glance at this poor soul who was passing so unwillingly out of my life. The seconds passed. A man came out of our entry and, turning to the left, walked at a rapid pace towards the Tudor Street gate. Still, she did not appear. Perhaps she had heard him on the stairs and was waiting to pass out unnoticed. But yet it was strange. Nearly a minute had elapsed since she started to descend the stairs. Could I have missed her? It seemed impossible, since I had come to the window almost immediately. A vague uneasiness began to take possession of me. I recalled her white face and frightened eyes, and as I stared down at the doorstep with growing anxiety, I found myself listening nervously for I knew not what. Suddenly I caught a sound, faint and vague, but certainly a sound, and it seemed to come from the staircase. In a moment I had the door open and was stealing on tiptoe out on the landing. The house was profoundly silent. No murmur even penetrated from the distant streets. I crept across the landing, breathing softly and listening. And then from the stillness below, but near at hand, came a faint, whispering sigh or moan. Instantly I sprang forward, all of a tremble, and darted down the stairs. At the first turn I saw, projecting round the angle, a woman's hand, plump and shapely and white as marble. With a gasp of terror, I flew round the turn of the staircase and, God in heaven, she was there. Huddled limply in the angle, her head resting against the baluster and one hand spread out on her bosom, she lay so still that she might have been dead, but for the shallow rise and fall of her breast and the wide-staring eyes that turned to me with such dreadful appeal. I stooped over her and spoke her name, and it seemed to me that a pitiful little smile trembled for a moment on the bloodless lips. But she made no answer beyond a faint, broken sigh, and it was only when she moved her hand slightly that the overwhelming horror of the reality burst upon me. Then when I saw the crimson stain upon her fingers and upon the bosom of her dress, the meaning of that horrible pallor, the sharpening features and strange, pinched expression flashed upon me with a shock that seemed to arrest the very blood at my heart. Yet, stunned as I was, I realized instantly that human skill could avail her nothing, that I could do naught for her but raise her from the sharp edge of the stair and rest her head on my arm. And so I held her, whispering endearments brokenly, and looking as well as I might through the blinding tears into those inscrutable eyes that gazed up at me, no longer with that stare of horror but with a vague and childlike wonder. And even as I looked, the change came in an instant. The wide eyelids relaxed and drooped, the eyes grew filmy and sightless, the hand slipped from her breast and dropped with a thud on the stair, and the supple body in my arms shrank of a sudden with the horrible limpness of death. Up to this point my recollection is clear, even vivid, but of what followed I have only a dim and confused impression. The awfulness, the unbelievable horror of this frightful thing that had happened, left me so dazed and numb that I recall, but vaguely, the passage of time of what went on around me in this terrible dream from which there was to be no waking. Dimly I recollect kneeling by her side on the silent staircase, but how long I know not, holding her poor body in my arms, and gazing incredulously at the marble-white face now with its drowsy lids and parted lips, grown suddenly girlish and fragile while the hot tears dropped down on her dress. Choking with grief and horror, and a fury of hate for the foul wretch who had done this appalling thing, and who was now far away out of reach. I see dimly still the livid marks of accursed fingers lingering yet on the whiteness around the mouth to tell me why no cry from her had reached me, and the dreadful, red-edged cut in the bodice, mutely demanding vengeance from God and man. And then of a sudden the silence is shattered by rushing feet and the clamor of voices. Someone, it is Jervis, leads me forcibly away to our room and places me in a chair by the table. Presently I see her lying on our sofa, drowsy-eyed, peaceful, like a marble figure on a tomb. And I see Thorndyke, with a strange, coppery flush and something grim and terrible in the set calm of his face, showing the letter, which I had left on the table, to a tall stranger, who hurries from the room. Anon come two constables with heads uncovered carrying a stretcher. I see her laid on the sordid bier and reverently covered. The dread procession moves out through the doorway, the door is shut after it, and so, in dreadful fulfillment of her words, she passed out of my life. Chapter 20. The Hue and Cry. The silence of the room remained unbroken for a quite considerable time after the two bearers had passed out with their dreadful burden. My two friends sat apart, and with a tact of which I was gratefully sensible, left me quietly undisturbed by banal words of consolation, to sustain the first shock of grief and horror and get my emotion under control. Still dazed and half incredulous, I sat with my elbows on the table and my teeth clenched hard, looking dreamily across the room, half unconsciously observing my two friends as they silently examined the fatal letter. I saw Thorndyke rise softly and take a small bottle from a cabinet, and watched him incuriously as he sprinkled on the paper some of the dark-colored powder that it contained. Then, I saw him blow the powder from the surface of the paper into the fire and scan the letter closely through a lens. And still no word was spoken. Only once, when Jervis, in crossing the room, let his hand rest for a moment on my shoulder, did any communication pass between us. And that silent touch told me unobtrusively, if it were needful to tell me how well, he understood my grief for the woman who had walked open-eyed into the valley of the shadow, had offered her heart's blood that I might pass unscathed. In about a quarter of an hour, the tall stranger returned, bringing with him an atmosphere of bustling activity that at once dispelled the gloomy silence. His busy presence and brisk, matter-of-fact speech, though distressing to me at the moment, served as a distraction and brought me out of my painful reverie to the grim realities of this appalling catastrophe. "You were quite right, sir," said he. "The chambers were an empty set. Mr. Cortland left them about 6 weeks ago, so they tell me at the office. I've looked them over carefully, and I think it is pretty clear what this man meant to do." "Did you go in?" asked Thorndyke. "Yes, Mr. Polton went with me and picked the lock, so I was able to go right through the rooms. And it is evident that this villain was not acting on the spur of the moment. He'd made a very neat plan, and I should say that it was pretty near to coming off. He had selected his chambers with remarkable judgment, and uncommonly well-suited they were to his purpose. In the first place, they were the top set, nothing above them, no chance strangers passing up or down, and they were the only set on that landing. Then some previous tenant had made a little trap or grill in the outer door, a little hole about 6 inches square with a sliding cover on the inside. That was the attraction, I fancy. The landing lamp was a light. He must have lighted it himself. As the landing was out of use, and, I fancy, he meant to watch through the grill for your friend to come and shoot him as he knocked at the door. "That would be taking more risk than he usually did," said Thorndyke. "You mean that the report of the shot would have been heard? Perhaps it might. But these modern, small-bore, repeating pistols make very little noise, though they are uncommonly deadly, especially if you open the nose of the bullets." "But," objected Thorndyke, "if he had been heard, there he would have been, boxed up in the chambers with no means of escape." Our acquaintance shook his head. "No," said he, "that's just what he wouldn't have been, and there is where he had planned the affair so neatly. These chambers are a double set. They have a second entrance that opens on the staircase of the next house. You see the idea. When he's fired his shot and made sure that it was all right or all wrong, if you prefer it, he would just have slipped through to the other entrance, let himself out, shut the door quietly, and walked down the stairs. Then, if the shot had been heard, there was he, coming out of the next house to join the crowd and see what was the matter. It was a clever scheme, and, as I say, it might very well have come off if this poor young lady hadn't given it away. So that's all about the chambers, and now, here he cast a glance in my direction, I must ask for a few particulars. He produced a large, black-covered notebook, and opening it on the table, looked at me inquiringly. "This," said Thorndyke, "is Mr. Superintendent Miller of the Criminal Investigation Department. He has charge of this case, so you must tell him exactly what happened, and try, Jardine, to be as clear and circumstantial as possible." The superintendent looked up sharply. "I had an impression," said he, "that this gentleman's name was Howard. He has used the name of Howard since he has been staying here, for reasons which no longer exist but which I will explain to you later. His name is Humphrey Jardine, and he is a bachelor of medicine." Mr. Miller entered these particulars in his book and then said, "I suppose it is not necessary to ask if you were actually present when this poor lady was murdered." "No, I was not." "And I presume you did not see the murderer." "I saw a man, whom I believe to have been the murderer, come out of our entry and walk quickly towards the Tudor Street gate, but I can give you no description of him. I saw him from the window and by the light of the entry lamp." The superintendent wrote down my answer and reflected for a few moments. "Perhaps," said he, "you had better just give us an account of what happened, and we can ask you any questions afterwards. It's very painful for you, I know, but it has to be, as you will understand." It was more than painful. It was harrowing to reconstitute that hideous tragedy, step by step, with the knowledge that the poor murdered corpse was still warm. But it had to be, and I did it haltingly, indeed, and with many a pause to command my voice. But in the end, I gave the superintendent a full description of the actual occurrences, though I withheld any reference to those words that my poor dead friend had spoken for my ear alone. When I had read through and signed my statement, Mr. Miller studied his notebook with an air of dissatisfaction and then turned to Thorndyke. "This is all quite clear, Doctor," said he, "and just about what you inferred from that letter. But it doesn't help us much. The question is, who is this man? I've an inkling that you know, Doctor." "I have a very strong suspicion as to who he is," replied Thorndyke. "That will do for me," said Miller. "Your strong suspicion is equal to another man's certainty. Do you know his name, sir?" "He has recently passed under the name of Samway," replied Thorndyke. "What his real name is, I think I shall be able to tell you later. Meanwhile, I can give you such particulars as are necessary for making an arrest." The superintendent looked narrowly at Thorndyke as the latter pressed the button of the electric bell. "Apparently, Doctor," said he, "you have been making some investigations concerning this man, and, as it was not in connection with this crime, it must have been in connection with something else." "Yes," replied Thorndyke, "you are quite right, Miller, and it will be a matter of the deepest regret to me to my dying day that circumstances have hindered those investigations as they have. The delay has cost this poor woman her life. A few more days and my case would almost certainly have been complete, and then this terrible disaster would have been impossible." As Thorndyke finished speaking, the door opened quietly, and Polton entered with a small, neatly made parcel in his hand. "Ah," said Thorndyke, "you guessed what I wanted and guessed right, as you always do, Polton. How many are there in that parcel?" "3 dozen, sir," replied Polton. "That ought to be enough for the moment. Hand them to the superintendent, Polton. If you want any more, Miller, we can let you have a further supply, and I am having a half-tone block made, which will be ready tomorrow morning." "Are these portraits of the man you suspect?" asked Miller. "No, I haven't his portrait, unfortunately, but on each card is a photograph of 3 of his fingerprints, which are all I have been able to collect, and on the back is a description which will enable you easily to identify him. You can post them off to the various seaports and telegraph the description in advance. And I would recommend you especially to keep a watch on Dover and Folkestone, as I know that he has been in the habit of using that route." "Speaking of fingerprints," said Miller, "have you tried that letter for them?" "Yes," replied Thorndyke. "I powdered it very carefully, but there is not a single trace of a fingerprint. He must have realized the risk he was taking and worn gloves when he wrote it." The superintendent pocketed the parcel with a thoughtful air, and, after a few moments' cogitation, turned once more to Thorndyke. "You've supplied me with the means of arresting the man, Doctor," said he, "but that's all. Supposing I find him and detain him in custody, what then? I don't know that he murdered this poor woman. Do you? Dr. Jardine can't identify him, and apparently no one else saw him. I have no doubt that you have substantial grounds for suspecting him, but I should like to know what they are." Thorndyke reflected for a moment or two before replying. "You are quite right, Miller," he said at length. "You ought to have enough information to establish a prima facie case. But I think that on this occasion I can say no more than that. If you produce the man, you can rely upon me to furnish enough evidence to secure a conviction. Will that do?" "It will do from you, sir," replied Miller, rising and buttoning his overcoat. "I will get this description circulated at once. Oh, there was one more matter. The name of the deceased lady was Samway, the same as that of the suspected murderer. What was the relationship?" "She passed, as and presumably was his wife." "Ah," said Miller. "I see. That was how she knew. Well, well. She was a brave woman to take the risk that she did, and she deserved something very different from what she got. But we are taught that there is a place where people who suffer injustice and misfortune in this world get it made up to them. I hope it's true, for her sake and for his," he added abruptly with a sudden change of tone. "Naturally you do," said Thorndyke, "but meanwhile our business is with this world. Spread your net close and wide, Miller. I shall never forgive you if you let this villain slip. It is our sacred duty to purge the world of his presence. You do your part, Miller, and be confident that I will do mine. You can depend on me to do my best, sir, said Miller, though I am working rather in the dark. I suppose you couldn't give me any sort of hint as to what you've got up your sleeve. You've no doubt, for instance, that it was really the man Samway who committed this murder. Thorndyke, according to his usual habit, considered the superintendent's question for a while before answering. At length he replied, I don't know why I shouldn't take you into my confidence to some extent, Miller, knowing you as I do. But you will remember that this is a confidence. The fact is that I am proposing to proceed against this man on an entirely different charge. But I am not quite ready to lay in information, and I want you to secure his person on the charge of murdering his wife while I complete the other case. Is that another case of murder? Asked Miller. Yes, the facts are briefly these. A certain Septimus Maddock, who was living with the Samways, died some time ago under what seemed to me very suspicious circumstances. He was nursed by Samway and his wife and by no one else. The cause of death given on the certificate was, in my opinion, not the true one, and I am proceeding to verify my theory as to what was the real cause of death. I see, said Miller. You are applying for an exhumation of the body. Well, hardly an exhumation. The man Maddock was cremated. Cremated? Exclaimed Miller. Then we've done. There isn't any body to exhume. No, agreed Thorndyke. There is no body, but there are the ashes. But surely, said Miller, you can't get any information out of a few handfuls of bone ash. That remains to be proved, replied Thorndyke. I have applied for an authority to make an exhaustive examination of those ashes, and, if my opinion as to the cause of death is correct, I shall be able to demonstrate its correctness, and that will involve a charge of murder against this man Samway. It will also support a charge against him of attempts to murder Dr. Jardine and furnish strong evidence connecting him with the horrible crime that has just been committed. So you see, Miller, that the important thing is to get possession of him before he has time to escape from this country, and hold him in custody, if necessary, while the evidence against him is being examined and completed. And I must impress on you that no time ought to be lost in getting the description circulated. No, that's true, said Miller. I'll go and telegraph it off at once, and I'll send one or two of our best men to watch the likely seaports. He shook hands with us all round, and when we had all most fervently wished him success, he took his departure. As soon as he was gone, Jervis turned to his senior, and looking at him with a sort of puzzled curiosity, exclaimed, You are a most astounding person, Thorndyke. You really are. I thought I had begun to see daylight in that Maddock case, and now I find that I was all abroad. And I can't, for the life of me, conceive what in the world you expect to discover by examining a few pounds of calcined phosphates. Suppose Maddock was poisoned, what evidence will be obtainable from the ashes? Of the poisons which could possibly have been used under the known circumstances, not one would leave a trace after cremation. But of course, you've thought of all that. Certainly, I have, replied Thorndyke, and I agree with you that the ashes of a body that has been cremated are highly unpromising material for a primary investigation. But does it not occur to you that, in a case where certain circumstantial evidence is available, excellent corroborative data might be obtained by the examination of the ashes? No, replied Jervis, I can't say that it does. It is not too late to consider the question, said Thorndyke. I shall probably not get the authority for a day or two, so you will have time to turn the problem over in the interval. It is quite worth your while, I assure you, apart from this particular case, as a mere exercise in constructive theory. You can acquire experience from imaginary cases as well as from real ones, as I have often pointed out. In fact, much of my own experience has been gained in this way. I think I have mentioned to you that, in my early days, when I had more leisure than practice, it was my custom to construct imaginary crimes of an elaborately skillful type, and then having, of course, all the facts to consider the appropriate procedure for their detection. It was a most valuable exercise, for I was thus able to furnish myself with an abundance of problems of a kind that in actual practice are met with only at long intervals of years. And since then, a quite considerable number of my imaginary cases have presented themselves, in a more or less modified form, for solution in the course of practice, and have come to me with the familiarity of problems that have already been considered and solved. That is what you should do, Jervis. Try the synthetic method and then consider what analytical procedure would be appropriate to your result. I have, Jervis replied gloomily. I have worked at this confounded case until I feel like a rat that has been trying to gnaw through a plate glass window. Still, I'll have another try. By the way, where are you going to make this examination? I think I shall do it here. I had thought of handing the ashes over to one of the more eminent analysts, but it will be only a small operation, well within the capacity of our own laboratory. I think of asking Professor Woodfield to come here and carry out the actual analysis. Polton will give him any help that he may want, and of course, we shall be here to give any further assistance if he should need it. Why not have made the analysis yourself? Asked Jervis. Is there anything specially difficult or intricate about it? Not at all, replied Thorndyke. But, as the case will have to go into court on a capital charge, that is, assuming that my hypothesis turns out to be correct, I thought it best to have the analysis made by a man whose name as an authority on chemistry will carry special weight. Neither the judge nor the jury are likely to have much special knowledge of chemistry, but they will be able to appreciate the fact that Woodfield is a man with a worldwide reputation, and they will respect his opinion accordingly. Yes, agreed Jervis, I think you are quite right. A well-known name goes a long way with a jury. I hope your experiment will turn out as you expect, and I hope, too, that some of Miller's men will manage to lay that murderous devil by the heels. But I'm afraid they'll have their work cut out. He is a clever scoundrel, one must admit that. How do you suppose he contrived to track Jardine here? I think, replied Thorndyke, that he must have seen us on one of the 2 occasions when we went to the mineral water works and followed us here. Then, when Jardine disappeared from his lodgings, he would naturally look for him here, this being, in fact, the only place known to him in connection with Jardine, excepting Batson's house, on which he also probably kept a watch. But how would he have discovered that Jardine actually was here? There are a number of ways in which he might have ascertained the fact. A good many persons knew that we had a new resident. We could not conceal his presence here. Many of our visitors have seen him, and the porter and hangers-on of the inn will have noticed him taking his exercise in the morning. Samway, himself, even, may have seen him, and he would easily have penetrated the disguise if he saw him out of doors, for there is no disguising a man's stature. He might have made inquiries of one of the porters or lamplighters, or he might have employed someone else to make inquiries. The fact that someone was staying here, and that his name was Howard, could not have been very difficult to discover. While, as for ourselves, we are as well known in the inn as the Griffin at Temple Bar. From the circumstance that he knew of our attendance at the Maidstone Assizes, it seems likely that he had subsidized some solicitor's clerk who would know our movements. And I suppose, said I, as he is gone now, I may as well go back to my lodgings. Not at all, replied Thorndyke. In the first place, we don't know that he is gone, and we do know that he is now absolutely desperate and reckless. And you must not forget, Jardine, that whether we charge him with murder in the case of Maddock, with the murder of poor Mrs. Samway, or the attempted murder of yourself, in either case you are the chief witness for the prosecution. You are the appointed instrument of retribution in this man's case, and you must take the utmost care of yourself until your mission is accomplished. He knows the value of your evidence better than you do, and it is still worth his while to get rid of you if he can. But you, I am sure, are at least as anxious as we are to see him hanged. I'd sooner twist his neck with my own hands, said I. I dare say you would, said Thorndyke, and it is perfectly natural that you should, but it is not desirable. This is a case for a few fathoms of good, stout hempen rope and the common hangman. The private vengeance of a decent man would be an undeserved honor for a wretch like this, so you must stay here quietly for a few days more and give us a little help when we need it. Thorndyke's decision was not altogether unwelcome. Shaken as I was by the shock of this horrible tragedy, I was in no state to return to the solitude of my lodgings. The quiet and tactful sympathy of my 2 friends, or I should rather say 3, for Polton was as kind and gentle as a woman was infinitely comforting, and their sober cheerfulness and the interest of their talk prevented me from brooding morbidly over the catastrophe of which I had been the involuntary cause. And dreadful as the associations of the place were, I could not but feel that those of my older resorts would be equally painful. For me, at present, the heath would be haunted by the figure of poor Letitia, walking at my side, telling me her pitiful tale and so pathetically craving my sympathy and friendship. And the Highgate Road could not but wring my heart with the recollection of that evening, when we had walked together up the narrow lane all unconscious of the black-hearted murderer stealing after us, and foiled only by that futile spy when, as we said good-bye, I had kissed her, and she had run off blushing like a girl. Moreover, if Thorndyke's chambers were fraught with terrible and gloomy associations, they were also pervaded by an atmosphere of resolute, relentless preparation, which was itself a relief to me. For, as the first shock of horrified grief passed, it left me possessed by a fury of hatred for the murderer and consumed by an inextinguishable craving for vengeance. Nor was the time of suspense so long as we had anticipated. On the very next morning, a letter arrived from the Home Office containing the necessary authority to make the proposed examination and informing Thorndyke that, on the following day, the police would take possession of the ashes, which would be delivered to him by an officer who would remain to witness the examination and to resume possession of the remains when it was concluded. I saw very little more of Thorndyke that day, but I gathered that he was busy making the final arrangements for the important work of the morrow, and in clearing off various tasks so as to leave himself free from engagements. Nor did I enjoy much of Jervis's society, for he, too, was anxious to have the day free for the crucial experiment, which was we hoped to solve the mystery of Septimus Maddock's death and explain the villain Samway's strange vindictiveness towards me. Left to myself, and by no means enamored of my own society, I wandered up to the laboratory to see what Polton was doing and to distract my gloomy thoughts by a little gossip with him on the various technical processes of which he possessed so much curious information. I found him arrayed in a white apron, with his sleeves turned up, busily occupied with what I took to be a slab of dough, which he had spread on a pastry board and was leveling with a hardwood rolling pin. He greeted me, as I entered with his queer, crinkly smile, but made no remark, and I stood a while in silence, watching him cut the paste in halves, sprinkle it with flour, fold it up, and once more roll it out into a sheet with the wooden pin. "Is this going to be a meat pie, Polton?" I asked at length. His smile broadened at my question for which I suspect he had been waiting. "I don't think you'd care much for the flavor of it if it was, sir," he answered. "But it does look like dough, doesn't it? It's molding wax, a special formula of the doctor's own." I thought that white powder was flour. "So it is, sir, the best wheaten flour. It's lighter than a mineral powder and more tenacious. You have to use some powder to reduce the stickiness of the wax, especially in a soft paste like this, which has a lot of lard in it." "What are you going to use it for?" I asked. "Ah," exclaimed Polton, pausing to give the paste a vicious whack with the rolling pin. "There you are, sir. That's just what I've been asking myself all the time I've been rolling it out. The doctor, Sir God bless him, is the most exasperating gentleman in the world. He fairly drives me mad with curiosity at times. He will give me a piece of work to do something to make, perhaps with full particulars, all the facts, you understand, perfectly clear and exact, with working drawings if necessary. But he never says what the thing is for. So I make a hypothesis for myself, whole bundles of hypotheses I make, and they always turn out wrong. I assure you, sir," he concluded with solemn emphasis, "that I spend the best part of my life asking myself conundrums and giving myself the wrong answers." "I should have thought," said I, "that you would have got used to his ways by now." "You can't get used to him," rejoined Polton. "It's impossible. He doesn't think like any other man. Ordinary men's brains are turned out pretty much alike from a single mold, like a batch of pottery. But the doctor's brain was a special order. If there was any mold at all, that mold was broken up when the job was finished." "What you mean is," said I, "that he has a great deal more intelligence than is given to the rank and file of humanity." "No, I don't," retorted Polton. "It isn't a question of quantity at all. It's a different kind of intelligence. Ordinary men have to reason from visible facts. He doesn't. He reasons from facts which his imagination tells him exists, but which nobody else can see. He's like a portrait painter who can do you a likeness of your face by looking at the back of your head. I suppose it's what he calls constructive imagination, such as Darwin and Harvey and Pasteur and other great discoverers had, which enabled them to see beyond the facts that were known to the common herd of humanity." I was somewhat doubtful as to the soundness of Polton's views on the transcendental intellect, though respectfully admiring of the thoughtfulness of this curious little handicraftsman. Accordingly, I returned to the more concrete subject of wax. "Haven't you any idea what this stuff is going to be used for?" "Not the slightest," he replied. "The doctor's instructions were to make 6 pounds of it, to make it soft enough to take a squeeze of a stiff feather if warmed gently, and firm enough to keep its shape in a half-inch layer with a plaster backing, and to be sure to have it ready by tomorrow morning. That's all. I know there's an important analysis on tomorrow, and I suppose this wax has got something to do with it. But as to what molding wax can have to do with a chemical analysis, that's a question that I can't make head or tail of." Neither could I, though I had more data than Polton appeared to possess. Nor could Jervis, to whom I propounded the riddle when he came in to tea. We went up to the laboratory together and inspected, not only the wax, but the exterior of 3 large parcels addressed to Professor Woodfield, care of Dr. Thorndyke, and bearing the labels of a firm of wholesale chemists. But neither of us could suggest any solution of the mystery. And the only result of our visit to the laboratory was that Polton was somewhat scandalized by the conduct of his junior employer, who consoled himself for his failure by executing with the wax a life-sized and highly grotesque portrait of Father Humperdinck. Chapter 21, The Final Problem. At exactly 11:30 in the following forenoon, Professor Woodfield arrived, bearing a massive cowhide bag which he deposited on a chair as a preliminary to taking off his hat and wiping his forehead. He was a big, burly, heavy-browed man, sparing of speech and rather gruff in manner. "Stuff arrived yet?" he asked when he had brought his forehead to a satisfactory polish. "I think it came yesterday morning," replied Thorndyke. "The deuce it did," exclaimed Woodfield. "Yes, 3 parcels from Townley and Draper's." "Oh, you're talking of the chemicals. I meant the other stuff." "No, the officer hasn't arrived yet, but I expect he will be here in a few minutes. Superintendent Miller is a scrupulously punctual man." The professor strode over to the window and glared out in the direction of Crown Office Row. "That man of yours got everything ready?" he asked. "Yes," answered Thorndyke, "and I have looked over the laboratory myself. Everything is ready. You can begin the instant the ashes are delivered to us." Woodfield expressed his satisfaction, or whatever he intended to express by a grunt, without removing his eyes from the approach to our chambers. "Cab coming," he announced a few moments later. "Man inside with a parcel, that the officer." Jervis looked out over the professor's shoulder. "Yes," said he, "that's Miller, and, confound it, here's Marchmont with old Humperdinck. Shall we bolt up to the laboratory and send down word that we're all out of town?" "I don't see why we should," said Thorndyke. "Woodfield won't be inconsolable if we have to leave him to work by himself for a while." The professor confirmed this statement by another grunt, and shortly afterwards, the clamor of the little brass knocker announced the arrival of the first contingent, which, when I opened the door, was seen to consist of the solicitor and his very reverend client. "My dear Thorndyke," exclaimed Marchmont, shaking our principal's hand, "what a shocking affair this murder, I mean. I read about it in the paper. A dreadful affair." "Yes, indeed," Thorndyke assented. "A most callous and horrible crime." "Terrible, terrible," said Marchmont. "So unpleasant for you, too, and so inconvenient. Actually on your own stairs, I understand. But I hope they'll be able to catch the villain. Have you any idea who he is?" "I have a very strong suspicion," Thorndyke replied. "Ah," exclaimed Marchmont. "I thought so. The rascal brought his pigs to the wrong market. What, like doing a burglary at Scotland Yard, he couldn't have known who lived here. Hallo, why, here's Mr. Miller, howdy-do, Superintendent." The officer, for whom I had left the door ajar, entered in his usual brisk fashion, and, having bestowed a comprehensive salutation on the assembled company, deposited on the table an apparently weighty parcel, securely wrapped and decorated with a label bearing the inscription, "This side up." "There, sir," said he, "there's your box of mystery, and I don't mind telling you that I'm on tenterhooks of curiosity to see what you are going to make of it." "Professor Woodfield is the presiding magician," said Thorndyke, "so we will hand it over to him. I suppose the casket is sealed." "Yes, it was sealed in my presence, and I've got to be present when the seals are broken." "We'll break the seals up in the laboratory," said Woodfield, "but we may as well undo the parcel here." He produced a solid-looking pocket knife, fitted with a practicable corkscrew, and, having cut the string, stripped off the wrappings of the parcel. "God bless my soul," exclaimed Marchmont as the last wrapping was removed. "Why, it's a cremation urn. What in the name of fortune are you going to do?" Miller tapped the lid of the urn with a dramatic gesture. "Dr. Thorndyke," said he, "is going, I hope, to extract from the ashes in this casket an instrument of vengeance on the murderer of Mrs. Samway." "Och," exclaimed Father Humperdinck, "do not speak of vengeance in ze presence of zese bore remains of a fellow creature. Justice if you lag, but not vengeance." "Vengeance is mine," says ze lord. "Am I's," agreed Miller. "That's perfectly true, sir, and we quite understand your point of view. Still, we've got our job to do, you know." "But," said Marchmont, "I don't understand. What is the connection? These appear to be the remains of Septimus Maddock, whoever he may have been, and he seems to have died last November. What has he to do with the murder of this poor woman, Samway?" "The connection is this," replied Thorndyke. "The man who murdered Mrs. Samway murdered the man whose ashes are in this urn. That is my proposition, and I hope, with the skillful aid of my friend Professor Woodfield, to prove it." "Well," said Marchmont, "it is a remarkable proposition, and the proof will be still more remarkable. I certainly thought that a body that had been cremated was beyond the reach of any possible inquiry." "I am afraid that is so, as a rule," Thorndyke admitted, "but I hope to find an exception in this case. Shall we go upstairs and commence the examination?" Woodfield having agreed with gruff emphasis, Miller picked up the casket, and we all proceeded to the laboratory, where Polton, like a presiding analytical demon, was discovered amidst his beloved apparatus. The casket was placed on a table, the seals broken, and the cover removed by Woodfield, whereupon we all, with one accord, craned forward to peer in at what looked like a mass of fragments of snowy madrepore coral. "Och," exclaimed Father Humperdinck, "but it is a solemn zot zat zese bore ashes vas once a living man just like ourselves." "Yes," said Marchmont, "it is, and I suppose we shall all be pretty much alike by the time we reach this stage. Cremation is a leveler, with a vengeance. Still, I will say this much, these remains are perfectly unobjectionable in every way, in fact they are almost agreeable in appearance, whereas an ordinary disinterment after this lapse of time would have been a most horrid business." "Yes, indeed," agreed Thorndyke. "I have had to make a good many examinations of exhumed bodies, and, as you say, they were very different from this. If I were not a practitioner of legal medicine in which exhumation often furnishes crucial evidence, I should say that this cleanly and decent method of disposing of the dead was incomparably superior to any other. Unfortunately, it has serious medico-legal drawbacks. I think, Woodfield, that we will turn the ashes out on that sheet of paper on the bench, and then, with your permission, I will pick out the recognizable fragments and examine them while you are working on the small, powdery portions." He took up the urn, which was an oblong terracotta vessel some 14 inches in length, and very carefully inverted it over the large sheet of clean white paper. Then, from the dazzling, snowy heap, he picked out daintily the larger fragments, handling them with the utmost tenderness, for, of course, they were excessively fragile, and finally transferring them, one by one, to another sheet of paper at the other end of the bench. The appearance of the remains was not quite as I had expected. Among the powdery debris was a quite considerable number of larger fragments, most of which were easily recognizable by the anatomical eye, while some of the larger long bones almost gave the impression of having been broken to enable them to be placed in the urn, and suggested that a partial reconstitution, for the purpose of determining the stature or other peculiarities of the skeleton, was by no means as impossible as I had supposed. But large and small alike, the pieces were strangely light and attenuated, like the ghosts of bones or artificial counterfeits in porous, spongy coral. When Thorndyke had picked out such of the fragments as he wished to examine, Professor Woodfield glanced casually over the collection. But suddenly he paused and, stooping over a large piece of the right innominate bone, narrowly inspected a somewhat shiny yellow stain on its inner surface. "Looks as if you were right, Thorndyke," he said in his laconic way, qualitatively, at any rate. "We shall see what the quantitative test says." I pored over that dull yellow stain as did Jervis also, but could make no guess at its nature or conceive any explanation of its presence. What interested me more was a small depression or cavity in the bone at the center of the stain. That it was not the result of cremation was obvious from the fact that it was surrounded by a small area of sclerosed or hardened bone, which was quite plainly distinguishable on the spongy background, and which clearly pointed to some inflammatory change that had occurred during life. But of its cause, as of that of the stain itself, I could think of no intelligible explanation. "Have you enough of the small fragments to go on with for the present, Woodfield?" Thorndyke asked. "Plenty," replied Woodfield. "Then," said Thorndyke, "I will get on with my side of the inquiry. I shall want the whole-plate camera first, Polton." While his assistant was preparing the camera, he laid several of the fragments on a baize-covered board and secured them in position by threads attached to wooden-headed pins like diminutive bradawls. When the fragments were fixed immovably, he placed the board in a vertical position on a stand in a good light, by which time Polton was ready to make the exposure. Meanwhile, Professor Woodfield was proceeding under the horrified supervision of Father Humperdinck with his part of the investigation. He was a matter-of-fact man, a chemist to the backbone, and to him it was evident that the late Septimus Maddock was simply many pounds of animal phosphates. Quite composedly, he shoveled up a scoopful of the ashes, which he emptied into the pan of a spring balance, and, having weighed out 1.25 pounds, shot the contents of the pan into a large mortar, and forthwith began to grind the fragments to a fine powder, humming a cheerful stave to the ring of the pestle. But his next proceeding scandalized the worthy Jesuit still more deeply. Having weighed out certain quantities of charcoal, sodium carbonate, and borax, he pulverized each in a second mortar, mixed the whole together, and shot the mixture into the first mortar, which contained the ash, stirring the entire contents up into a repulsive-looking gray powder. "But, my dear sir," exclaimed Father Humperdinck, "you are destroying the remains." Woodfield looked at him from under his beetling brows, but went on stirring. "Matter is indestructible," he replied stolidly, and with this he tipped the contents of the mortar on to a sheet of paper and transferred them to a large fireclay crucible. "Now, Polton," said he, "is the furnace ready?" Polton disengaged himself for a moment from the camera and took up a position by the side of the big fireclay drum with his hand on the gas cock. Then Woodfield, having dropped 3 or 4 large iron nails into the crucible, carried the latter over to the furnace and lowered it into the central cavity. The cock was turned on by Polton and a match applied, whereupon a great purplish flame shot up with a roar from the mouth of the furnace. And even when this had been confined by the dropping on of the massive cover, the iron-cased cylinder continued to emit a muffled, sullen growl. While the crucible was heating, I transferred my attention to Thorndyke. The photographic operations were now concluded, and the molding wax had just been produced from a warmed incubator. Polton's curiosity and mine was about to be satisfied. Thorndyke began by laying a thick slab of the warm and pliable wax on the middle of a smooth plate of varnished plaster, at each corner of which was a small hemispherical pit, and dusting powdered French chalk sparingly over the level surface of the wax. Then he took the large fragment of bone, which bore the mysterious yellow stain, and laid it on the wax with the stained side uppermost, pressing it very gently until it gradually sank into the soft, pasty mass. Next, he took a somewhat smaller slab of wax, and having dusted its surface with French chalk, laid it on the fragment of bone, pressing it on gently but firmly, especially in the neighborhood of the stain. Having squeezed some irregular-shaped lumps of wax on the back of the top slab, he fastened a strip of India rubber round the edge of the plaster plate, so that it formed an upright rim, and turned to Polton. "Now mix a bowl of plaster and mix it extra stiff, so that it will set quickly and hard." With a soft brush he painted a thin coat of oil on the exposed portion of the plaster plate, up to the edges of the wax, and including the little circular hollows. By the time he had done this, Polton reappeared from the workshop with a basin of liquid plaster, which he was beating up with a spoon as if preparing a custard or batter pudding. As soon as the plaster began to thicken, he poured it on the wax and the oiled slab until it formed a level mass, nearly flush with the top of the India rubber rim. In a surprisingly short time, the smooth, creamy liquid solidified into a substance having the appearance of icing sugar. and when Polton had stripped away the India rubber rim, exposing the edge of the new plaster slab, this part of the process was finished. "We will put this mold aside for the plaster to harden while we make the other mold," said Thorndyke. "Aren't you going to make molds of all the fragments?" asked Jervis. "No," Thorndyke answered. "The photographs of the rest will be sufficient, and I don't think we shall want even those. In fact, what I am doing now is merely by way of extra precaution. We are obliged to destroy the fragments in order to make the analysis, so I am just putting their appearance on record. You never know what an ingenious defending counsel may spring on you." As Polton produced a second plate of varnished plaster and Thorndyke began to prepare the wax for the next mold, I turned my attention once more to Professor Woodfield. He had now deserted the mortar in which he had been preparing a further supply of the stuff, and taken up a position by the furnace, with a long pair of crucible tongs in his hand. On the bench, hard by, was an iron plate, and on this an oblong block of iron in which were 6 conical hollows. Presently Woodfield glanced at his watch, turned off the gas cock, removed the cover of the furnace with his tongs, and, reaching down into the glowing interior, lifted out the nearly white-hot crucible. Instantly Marchmont, Humperdinck, and Jervis gathered round to watch, and even Thorndyke left his mold to come and see the result of the first trial. Having stood the crucible on the iron plate, while he picked out the large nails, one by one, Woodfield lifted it and steadily poured its molten contents into the first hollow in the iron block, which they soon filled, and overflowing ran along the iron plate in glowing streams that soon grew dull from contact with the cold surface. I noticed that, as the crucible was slowly tilted, Thorndyke kept his eyes fixed on its interior, as also did Jervis and Woodfield. And watching closely, I saw just as the vessel was nearly empty, what looked somewhat like a red-hot oil globule floating in the last of the glowing liquid. This passed out as the crucible was tilted further, and disappeared into the iron mold. When Woodfield, having exchanged a quick, significant glance with Thorndyke, proceeded forthwith, in his matter-of-fact way, to fill up the still red-hot vessel with another pound and a quarter of the late Septimus Maddock. "I suppose," said Marchmont, "it is premature to ask you what is the final object of these very interesting operations." "It's no use asking me," replied Woodfield, "because I don't know. I am searching for traces of a particular substance, but what may be the significance of its presence, I haven't the slightest idea. You'd better ask Dr. Thorndyke, and he won't tell you." "No, I know," said Marchmont. "Thorndyke will never tell you anything until he can tell you everything. By the way, will the remains be completely destroyed, or will it be possible to recover them?" "They are not destroyed at all," replied Woodfield. "They are all in the slag that came out of the crucible. We shall simply put the slag in the urn. There is a little charcoal, soda, and borax added, but nothing is taken away." I could see that to the unchemical mind of Father Humperdinck this was far from satisfactory, and I observed him poring, with obvious disapproval, over the dark-colored, glassy masses of slag on the iron plate. Ashes to ashes was an intelligible formula, but ashes to slag was quite another matter, for which no provision had been made in any known ritual. After a rather hurried luncheon, the wax molds were carefully opened and the fragments of bone picked out, when it was seen that each fragment had left a perfect impression on the wax surface into which it had been pressed. These hollow impressions were now filled with liquid plaster, and, when the latter had thickened sufficiently, the 2 halves of each mold were quickly fitted together and kept in close contact by a weight. During the interval which was necessary to allow of the plaster setting quite firmly, I had leisure to note that Professor Woodfield had filled 2 more of the cavities in the iron mold. Now that the furnace was thoroughly hot, he was able to work rather more quickly, and he had economized time by leaving a crucible to heat while we were at lunch. He was preparing to take the 4th charge from the furnace, when I observed Polton removing the weight from one of the molds, and hurriedly transferred my patronage to his part of the entertainment. The mold on which he was operating was the one bearing the impressions of the stained fragment of the innominate bone, and when he separated the 2 halves and exposed the newly made cast, inside one might have thought that the actual bone had been left in. So perfectly did the snowy plaster cast reproduce the dazzlingly white calcined bone. But naturally, the stain did not appear in the cast. a defect which Thorndyke proceeded at once to remedy by making a tracing of the exact position and extent of the colored patch and transferring it to the cast. Then, and not till then, Thorndyke regretfully handed the original fragment to Professor Woodfield, who impassively dropped it into the mortar and pounded it into a mere characterless powder. After the opening of the second mold and the removal of the casts, the interest of the investigation lapsed for a time. Woodfield's operations were doubtless the most important part of the procedure, but they were not thrilling to look on at. In fact, they became, by unvarying repetition, decidedly tedious, and when the last charge containing the uttermost crumb of ash had been placed in the furnace, and there was nothing to do but stare at the great fireclay drum, Marchmont and Humperdinck began to yawn in the most portentous manner. I rather wondered that they did not go, for the investigation was no business of theirs, and there was little entertainment in gazing at the outside of the furnace or watching Polton, and the superintendent gather up the masses of slag from the plate and drop them into the casket. But I supposed that they, like myself, were consoling themselves for the tedium of the chemist's manipulations by the prospect of satisfying their curiosity as to the final result of the experiment. When at length the last charge was ready, Woodfield withdrew the white-hot crucible from the furnace and stood it on the iron plate. But this time he did not pour out the contents. Instead, he tilted the iron mold, and picking out the conical masses of slag that it contained, one by one, lowered them with his tongs into the hot crucible. Then, having thrown in a little fresh flux, he returned the crucible to the furnace. "Why didn't he pour out the melted stuff this time?" Marchmont asked. "Because," Thorndyke replied, "I want, for certain reasons, to have the total result of the analysis in a single mass. Each of those little cones of slag contains the result from a sixth part of the ash. The crucible now contains the matter extracted from the whole of the ashes. For my purposes, this is more suitable, as you will see in a few minutes, for we shall not have to leave the crucible in the furnace so long this time." "I'm glad of that," said Marchmont, "though this has been a most interesting, and I may say, fascinating experience. I am delighted to have had an opportunity of witnessing these most instructive endura." The rest of the sentence was rendered somewhat obscure by a colossal yawn. But very soon the interest of the proceedings was revived by Woodfield, who approached the furnace with a determined air and removed its cover with somewhat of a flourish. "Now we shall see, Thorndyke," said he, turning off the gas and reaching down into the glowing cavity with his tongs. He lifted out the crucible and, standing it on the iron plate, took out the nails, tapping each on the side of the pot as he withdrew it. "Do you want me to pour it out, or shall I break the pot?" asked Woodfield. "That rests with you," replied Thorndyke. "Better break the pot then," said Woodfield. This entailed a further spell of expectant waiting, and we all stood round, gazing impatiently at the crucible as it slowly faded from bright red to dull red, and from this to its natural dull drab. It was quite a long time before Woodfield considered it cool enough to be broken. Indeed, I half suspected him of prolonging our suspense with deliberate malice. At length he took up a peculiarly shaped hammer which Polton had handed to him, and laying the crucible on its side, struck it sharply near the bottom with the pointed beak. Then he turned the pot over and struck a similar blow on the opposite side, upon which the bottom of the crucible broke off cleanly, exposing the mass of dark, glassy slag, and embedded in it a bright button of metal. "What metal is that?" Jervis demanded eagerly. The professor struck the button smartly with the hammer, whereupon it detached itself from the slag and rolled onto the plate. "Lead," said he. "I don't vouch for its purity, but it is undoubtedly lead." Jervis turned to Thorndyke with a puzzled look. "You can't be suggesting," said he, "that this was a case of acute lead poisoning. The circumstances didn't admit of it, and besides, the quantity of lead is impossibly large." "I should suppose," interposed Miller, "that the doctor was suggesting a most particularly acute form of lead poisoning, only that it is impossible to imagine that a cremation certificate would be granted in a case where a man had been killed by a pistol shot." "I am not so sure of that," said Thorndyke, "though it is not likely that a cremation certificate would be applied for under those circumstances, but I am certainly not suggesting lead poisoning." "What do you say is the weight of this button, Thorndyke?" the professor asked. "That," replied Thorndyke, depends on its relation to the total content of lead in the ashes. What percentage do you suppose has been lost in the process of reduction? Not more than 10%. I hope you may take this button as representing 90% of the total lead, perhaps a little more. Thorndyke made a rapid calculation on a scrap of paper. I suggest, said he, that the total lead in the ashes was 386 grains. Deducting a tenth, say 38½ grains, we have 347½ grains, which should be the weight of this button. Woodfield picked up the button and, striding over to the glass case which contained the chemical balance, slid up the front, and, placing the button in one pan, put the weight corresponding to Thorndyke's estimate in the other. On turning the handle that released the balance, it was seen that the button was appreciably heavier than Thorndyke had stated, and Woodfield adjusted the weights with a small pair of forceps until the index stood in the middle of the graduated arc. The weight is 349½ grains, said Woodfield. That means that my assay was rather better than I thought. You were quite right, Thorndyke, as you generally are. I wonder what the object was that weighed 386 grains. Are you going to tell us? Thorndyke felt in his waistcoat pocket. It was an object, said he, very similar to this. As he spoke, he produced a rather large, dark-colored bullet, which he handed to Woodfield, who immediately placed it in the pan of the balance and tested its weight. Just a fraction short of 387 grains, said he. The superintendent peered curiously into the balance case, and, taking the bullet out of the pan, turned it over in his fingers. That's not a modern bullet, said he. They don't make 'em that size now, and they don't generally make 'em of pure lead. No, Thorndyke agreed. They don't. This is an old French bullet, a chassepot of about 1870. A chassepot? Exclaimed Humperdinck with suddenly awakened interest. Yes, said Thorndyke. And this button, he picked it up from the floor of the balance case as he spoke, was once a chassepot bullet, too. This, Father Humperdinck, he added, holding out the little mass of metal towards the Jesuit, was the bullet which struck your friend, Vitalis Reinhardt, near Saarbrück more than 30 years ago. The priest was thunderstruck. For some seconds, he gazed from Thorndyke's face to the button of lead, with his mouth agape and an expression of utter stupefaction. But, he exclaimed at length, it is impossible. How can it be in the ashes of a stranger? I take it, said Marchmont, that Dr. Thorndyke is suggesting that this was the body of Vitalis Reinhardt. Undoubtedly I am, said Thorndyke. It sounds a rather bold supposition, Marchmont observed, a little dubiously. Isn't it basing a somewhat startling conclusion upon rather slender data? The presence of the lead is a striking fact, but still, taken alone. But it isn't taken alone, Thorndyke interrupted. It is the final link in a long chain of evidence. You will hear that evidence later, but, as it happens, I can prove the identity of these remains from facts elicited by the examination that we have just made. Let me put the argument briefly. First, I will draw your attention to these plaster casts, which you have seen me make from the original bones. Take, to begin with, these small fragments. Dr. Jervis will tell you what bones they are. He handed the small casts to Jervis, who looked them over not for the first time and passed them to me. I say that they represent 2 complete fingers and the first, or proximal, joint of a right thumb. What do you say, Jardine? That is what I had already made them out to be, I replied. Very well, said Thorndyke. That gives us an important initial fact. These remains contain 2 complete fingers and the first joint of a thumb, but these remains profess to be those of a man named Septimus Maddock. Now this man is known to have had deformed hands, of the kind described as brachydactylous. In such hands, all the fingers are incomplete. They have only 2 joints instead of the normal 3, and the first, or proximal joint of the thumb, is absent. Obviously, then, these remains cannot be those of Septimus Maddock, as alleged. But, if not Maddock's remains, whose are they? From certain facts known to me, I had assumed them to be those of Vitalis Reinhardt. Let us see what support that assumption has received. Reinhardt is known to have been wounded in the right hip by a chassepot bullet, and the bullet was never extracted. Now I find, among these remains, a considerable portion of the right hip bone. In that bone is a mark which plainly shows that it has been perforated and the perforation repaired, and there is a cavity in which a foreign body of about the size of a chassepot bullet has been partly embedded. The chemical composition of that foreign body is plainly indicated by a stain which surrounds the cavity, which stain is evidently due to oxide of lead. Clearly, the foreign body was composed of lead, which will have melted in the cremation furnace and run away, but left a small portion in the cavity, which small portion, becoming oxidized, the oxide will have liquefied and become soaked up by the absorbent bone ash, thus producing the stain. Finally, we find by assay that this foreign body actually was composed of lead and that its weight was within a negligible amount of error 386 grains, which is the weight of a chassepot bullet. I say that the evidence, from the ashes alone, is conclusive, but this is only corroborative of conclusions that I had already formed on a quite considerable body of evidence. Are you satisfied, Marchmont? I mean, of course, only in respect of a prima facie case. Perfectly satisfied, replied Marchmont. And now I understand why you insisted on my being present at this investigation and bringing Father Humperdinck, which, I must admit, has been puzzling me the whole day. By the way, I rather infer from what you said that there has been foul play. Is that so? I think, replied Thorndyke, there can hardly be a doubt that Reinhardt was murdered by Septimus Maddock. Father Humperdinck's face suddenly turned purple. And this man Maddock, he exclaimed fiercely, this murderer of my poor friend Vitalis, where is he? He is being sought by the police at this moment, replied Thorndyke. He must be caught, Father Humperdinck shouted in a furious voice, and when he is caught he must be punished as he deserves. I shall not one moment rest until he is hanged as high as Haman. Here I caught a quick glance from Marchmont's eyes and seemed to hear a faint murmur which framed the words, "Vengeance is mine." But the Jesuit continued, after a momentary pause, in the same loud, angry tone. This villain has a double grime gommeted. He has murdered a goot, a generous, a bias man, and he has robbed ze boor, ze suffering, and ze unfortunate. How has he done that? Asked Marchmont. By murdering ze benefactor of our society, was the answer. Yes, to be sure, agreed the solicitor. I hadn't thought of that. Of course, the original will in favor of Miss Vine probably stands without modification. At this point, Superintendent Miller interposed. You were saying, sir, that the man Maddock is now being sought by the police. Do you mean under that name? No, answered Thorndyke. I mean under the name of Samway. Septimus Maddock, alias Isaac Van Dam, is written off as deceased. But Samway, alias Maddock, alias Burton of Bruges, alias Gill, is his reincarnation, and as such, I commend him to your attention, and I hope, Miller, you will be able to produce him shortly in the flesh. The evidence, as you see, is now ready, and all that is lacking is the prisoner. He shan't be lacking long, sir, if any efforts of mine can bring him to light. I see a case here that will pay for all the work that we can put into it, and now, with your permission, Doctor, I will take possession of this urn and get off, to see that everything necessary is being done. The superintendent, as so often happens with departing guests, infected our other two visitors with a sudden desire to be gone. Father Humperdinck, especially, seemed unwilling to lose sight of the police officer who was correspondingly anxious to escape and, having wished us a very hasty adieu, hurried down the stairs in his wake, followed, at a greater interval, by his legal adviser. Chapter 22, Thorndyke reviews the case. When Professor Woodfield, having deliberately packed his bag, and to my great relief and Jervis's declined Thorndyke's invitation to stay and take tea with us, presently took his departure, we descended to the sitting-room, whither Polton followed us almost immediately with a tea tray, having, apparently, boiled the kettle in the adjacent workshop, while the final act of the analysis was in progress. He placed the tray on a small table by Thorndyke's chair, and, evidently, anticipating the inevitable discussion on the results of the analysis, made up the fire on a liberal scale and retired with unconcealed reluctance. As soon as we were alone, Jervis opened the subject by voicing his and my joint desire for more light. This has been a great surprise to me, Thorndyke, said he. A complete surprise? Thorndyke asked. No, I can't say that. The solution of the problem was one that I had proposed to myself, but I had rejected it as impossible, and it looks impossible still, though I now know it to be the true solution. I quite appreciate your difficulty, said Thorndyke, and I see that if you did not happen to light on the answer to it, the difficulty was insuperable. That was the really brilliant feature in Maddock's plan. But for a single fact which was almost certain to be overlooked, the real explanation of the circumstances would appear utterly incredible. Even if suspicion had been aroused later and the true explanation suggested, there seemed to be one fact with which it was absolutely irreconcilable. Yes, agreed Jervis, that is what I have felt. The truth is, said Thorndyke, that this crime was planned with the most diabolical cleverness and subtlety. We realize that when we consider by what an infinitely narrow margin it failed. Indeed, we can hardly say that it did fail. As far as we can see, it succeeded completely, and if the criminal could only have accepted its success, there seems to be no reason why any discovery should ever have taken place. Looking back on the case, we see that our experience has been the same as O'Donnell's. We had no clue whatever excepting the one that was furnished by the criminal himself in his unnecessary efforts to obtain even greater security. Suppose Maddock, having carried out his plan successfully, had been content to leave it at that, who would have known or even suspected that a crime had been committed? Not a soul, I believe. But instead of that, he must needs do what the criminal almost invariably does. He must tinker at the crime when all is going well and surround himself by a number of needless safeguards by which, in the end, attention is attracted to his doings. He knows, or believes he knows, that Jardine has in his possession certain knowledge of a highly dangerous character. He does not ask himself whether Jardine is aware that he possesses such knowledge, but, appraising that knowledge at what he himself knows to be its value, he decides to get rid of Jardine as the one element of danger. And that was where he failed. If he had left Jardine alone, the whole affair would have passed off as perfectly normal, and its details would soon have been lost sight of and forgot. Even as it was, he missed complete success only by a hair's breadth. But for the most trivial coincidence, Jardine's body might be lying undiscovered in that cellar at this very moment. That's a comfortable thought for you, Jardine, my younger colleague remarked. Very, I agreed, with a slight shudder at the recollection of that horrible death trap. But what was the coincidence? I never understood how you came to be in that most unlikely place at that very opportune moment. It was the merest chance, replied Thorndyke. I happened to have called in at the hospital that evening, and, having an hour to spare, it occurred to me to look in at Batson's and see if you were getting on quite happily in your new command. As I had induced you to take charge, I felt some sort of responsibility in the matter. It was exceedingly kind of you, sir, said I. Not in the least, said Thorndyke. It was just the ordinary solicitude of the teacher for a promising pupil. Well, when I arrived at the house, I found that excellent girl, Maggie, standing on the doorstep, looking anxiously up and down the street. It seemed that, on reflection, she was still convinced that the works were untenanted, and the oddity of the whole set of circumstances had made her somewhat uneasy. I waited a few minutes and disposed of one or two patients. And then, as you did not return, after what seemed an unaccountably long absence, I very easily induced her to show me where the place was. And when we arrived there, the deserted aspect of the building and the notice board over the gate seemed rather to justify her anxiety. I rang the bell loudly, as I dare say you know, but I did not wait very long. When I failed to get any response, I too became suspicious and proceeded without delay to pick the lock of the wicket. And it is most fortunate that the wicket was unprovided with a bolt, which would have delayed me very considerably. You know the rest. When I shouted your name, you must have tried to answer, for I caught a kind of muffled groan and the sound of tapping, which guided me and Maggie to your prison. But it was a near thing, for, when I opened the cellar door, you fell out quite unconscious and accompanied by a gush of carbon dioxide that was absolutely stifling. Yes, said I, it was touch and go. A few minutes more and it would have been all up with me. I realized that as soon as I recovered consciousness, but I couldn't, for the life of me, understand why anybody should want to murder me, and I am not so very clear on the subject now. I really knew nothing about Maddock. You knew more than anyone else knew, and he thought you knew more than you did. But perhaps it would be instructive to review the case in detail. It would be very instructive to me, said Jervis, for I don't, Even now, see how you managed to bridge over those gaps that stopped me in my attempts to make a hypothesis that covered all the circumstances. Very well, said Thorndyke. Then we will begin at the beginning, and the beginning, for me, was the finding of Jardine, as I have described it. Here was a pretty plain case of attempted murder, evidently premeditated and apparently committed by some person who had access to these works. Evidently, also, conceived and planned with considerable knowledge, skill, and foresight, though with how much foresight I did not realize until I had heard Jardine's story. When I had Jardine's account of the affair, I saw that the crime had been planned with quite remarkable ingenuity and judgment. In fact, the circumstances had been so carefully considered, and contingencies so well provided for that, but for a single tactical error, the plan would have succeeded. That error was in making the pretended emergency a surgical injury. If the letter to Jardine had stated that a man was in a fit instead of suffering from a wound, our friend would have had no need to call at the surgery for appliances, but would have gone straight to the works. And there, in all probability, his body would still be lying, for no one would have known whither he had gone. And even if his body had been accidentally discovered, all traces of the means by which he had been killed would probably have been removed. There would have been nothing to show that he had not strayed into the deserted factory and turned on the gas himself. Indeed, it is pretty certain that matters would have been so arranged as to convey that impression to the persons who made the discovery. There was the letter, said I, that would have given things away to some extent. But you would have had it in your pocket, from which he would, of course, have removed it. We may be sure that he had not overlooked the letter. It was the need for surgical appliances that he had overlooked. But in spite of this error, the plan was ingenious, subtle, and clearly not the work of an ignorant man. And here I would point out to you that this latter fact was one of great importance in searching for the solution of the mystery. We knew something of our man. He was subtle, resourceful, and absolutely ruthless. Noting this, I was prepared, in pursuing the case, to find his other actions characterized by subtlety, resourcefulness, and ruthlessness. His further actions were not going to be those of a dullard or an ignoramus. But this was not all the information that I had concerning the personality of this unknown villain. Jervis and I looked over the cellars that same night within an hour and a half of the rescue, and before anything had been moved. We were then in a position to infer that the unknown was probably a somewhat tall man and above the average of strength, as shown by the weight, position, and arrangement of the iron bottles. Moreover, since there was no faintest trace of a fingerprint on any of them, it followed that some precaution against them such as gloves had been adopted, which again suggested either a professional criminal or a person well acquainted with criminal methods. So much for the man. As to the rest of the information that I obtained by looking into the cellar, it seemed at the time meager enough, and yet, when considered by the light of Jardine's statement, it turned out to be of vital importance. You remember what it was, Jardine? That cellar contained certain objects. They seemed very unilluminating and commonplace, but according to my invariable custom, I considered them attentively and made a written list of them. Do you remember what they were? Yes, quite well. There were 10 empty cylinders, a spanner, a packing case. What were the dimensions of the case? Thorndyke interrupted. 7 feet long by 2.5 wide and deep. Then there were a couple of waterproof sheets and a quantity of straw. That is the lot, I think, and I'll be hanged if I can see what any of them excepting the 3 cylinders that were used for my benefit have to do with the case. Can you, Jervis? I'm afraid I can't, he replied. They are all such very ordinary objects. Ordinary or not, said Thorndyke. There they were, and I made a note of them on the principle which I am continually impressing on my students that you can never judge in advance what the evidential value of any fact will be, and on the further principle that, in estimating evidence, there is no such thing as a commonplace fact or object. Until I had heard Jardine's account of the affair, there was not much to be gained by thinking about the possibilities that it presented. There was, however, one point to be settled, and I dealt with it at once. My slight inspection of the works had shown that no business was being carried on in them, and the question was whether they were completely untenanted or whether there was some person who had regular access to them. My inquiries resulted, as you know, in the unearthing of the mysterious Mr. Gill, but what his relation to the affair might be I was not, at the moment, in a position to judge. Then came our talk with Jardine, from which emerged the fact that the ordinary motives of murder apparently did not exist in this case, and that the crime appeared to have its origin in circumstances that had arisen locally and recently. And, on our proceeding to search for such conditions as might conceivably generate an adequate motive, we lighted on a case of cremation. Now, it is my habit, whenever I have to deal with death which has been followed by cremation, to approach the case with the utmost caution and scrutinize the circumstances most narrowly. For admirable as is this method of disposing of the dead regarded from a hygienic standpoint, it has the fatal defect of lending itself most perfectly to the more subtle forms of murder, and especially to the administration of poison. By cremation, all traces of the alkaloids, the toxins and the other organic poisons are utterly destroyed, while of the metals, the three whose compounds are most commonly employed for criminal purposes, arsenic, antimony, and mercury, are volatilized by heat and would be more or less completely dissipated during the incineration of the body. It is true that the most elaborate precautions in the form of examination and certification are prescribed and usually taken, I presume, before cremation is performed. But as every medical jurist knows, precautions taken before the event are useless, for, to be effective, they have to cover every possible cause of death, which would be impracticable. Hence, as suspicion, in case of poisoning, commonly does not arise until some time after death, I always give the closest consideration to the antecedent circumstances in cases where cremation has been performed. But in this case of Jardine's, it was at once obvious that the circumstances called for the minutest inquiry and that no inquiry had been made. On the face of it, the case was a suspicious one, and the curious incident that Jardine described made it look more suspicious still, and moreover, suggested a possible motive for the attempt on his life. Apparently he had seen, or was believed to have seen, something that he was not desired to see, something that it was not intended that anyone should see. Now what might that something have been? Apparently it was connected with the hand or with the part of the arm adjacent to the hand. I considered the possibilities, and at once they fell into two categories: that something might have been a wound, an injury, a hypodermic needle mark, something, that is to say, related to the cause of death, or it might have been a mutilation, a deformity, a finger ring, a tattoo mark, something, that is to say, related to the identity of the deceased. And it followed that the cremation might have been made use of to conceal either the cause of death or the identity of the body. But all this was purely speculative. The case looked suspicious, but there was not a particle of positive evidence that anything abnormal had occurred. At this point, Jardine exploded on us his second mystery, that of the dead cleric at Hampstead. This gave us, at once, an adequate motive for getting rid of him, for it had every appearance of a case of murder with successful concealment of the body, and Jardine was the only witness who could testify to its having occurred. On hearing of this, I was for a moment disposed to dismiss the cremation case, to consider that the suspicious elements in it had been magnified by our imaginations in our endeavors to find an explanation of the assault on Jardine. Moreover, since we now had a sufficient motive for that assault, the cremation case appeared to be outside the scope of the inquiry. But there was a difficulty. It was now 6 weeks since Jardine had encountered the body in the lane, and during that time he had been entirely unmolested. The assault had occurred on his moving into a new neighborhood, to which he had come unexpectedly and unannounced. Moreover, the assault had been committed by some person who either had access to the factory or was, at least, well acquainted with it, and who, therefore, seemed to be connected with the new neighborhood. And it was committed within a few days of the cremation incident. Furthermore, the assault was manifestly premeditated and prepared, but yet the circumstances, namely, Jardine's recent and unexpected appearance in the neighborhood, were such as to make it certain that the crime could have been planned only a day or two before its execution, which again seemed to connect it with the cremation case rather than with the Hampstead case. There were two more points. We have seen that Jardine's would-be murderer was a subtle, ingenious, resourceful, and cautious villain. But a crime adjusted to the conditions of cremation is exactly such a crime as we should expect of such a man, whereas the Hampstead crime, assuming it to be a crime, appeared to have been a somewhat clumsy affair, though the successful concealment of the body pointed to a person of some capacity. so that the former crime was more congruous with the known personality of the would-be murderer than the latter. The second point was made on further investigation. The day after our consultation, I looked round the neighborhood with the aid of a large-scale map, when I discovered that the yard of the factory in Norton Street backed on the garden of the Samways' house in Gayton Street. This, again, suggested a connection between the cremation case and the assault on Jardine, and the suggestion was so strong that once more the cremation incident assumed the uppermost place in my mind. I considered that case at length. Assuming a crime to have been committed, what was the probable nature of that crime? Now, cremation, as I have said, tends to destroy two kinds of evidence, namely, that relating to the cause of death and that relating to the identity of the body, whence it follows that the two crimes which it may be used to conceal are murder and substitution. To which of these crimes did the evidence point in the present instance? Well, we had the undoubted fact that cremation had been performed pursuant to the expressed wishes of Septimus Maddock, the man who was alleged to have been cremated. But if it was a case of murder, the crime must have been hurriedly planned a few days before the man's death, that is, after the execution of the will. For we could assume that Maddock would not have connived at his own murder, whereas, if it was a case of substitution, Maddock himself was probably the actual agent. Considering the circumstances, the inexplicable, symptomless illness, and the unexpected death, the latter crime was obviously more probable than the former. The illness, in that case, would be a sham illness deliberately planned to prepare the way for the introduction of the substituted body. Moreover, the attendant circumstances were more in favor of substitution than of murder. Of the 3 doctors who saw the body, only one had seen the living man, and that one, Batson, was more than half blind and wholly inattentive and neglectful. For the purpose of substitution, no more perfectly suitable practitioner could have been selected. The identity of the body was taken for granted naturally enough. I admit, and no verification was even thought of. Then, as to Jardine's experience. The hand or wrist is not at all a likely region on which to find either a fatal injury or the trace of a hypodermic injection, whereas it is a most important region for purposes of identification. The hand is highly characteristic in itself even when normal, and there is no part of the body that is so subject to mutilation or in which mutilations and deformities are so striking, so conspicuous, and so characteristic. Lost fingers, stiff fingers, webbed fingers, supernumerary fingers, contracted palm, deformed nails, brachydactylia, and numerous other abnormal conditions are not only easily recognized, but since the hand is usually unclothed, and visible, their existence will be known to a large number of persons. The evidence, in short, was strongly in favor of substitution as against murder. If, however, the body which was cremated was not that of Maddock, then it was the body of some other person. That is to say that the theory of substitution left us with a dead body that was unaccounted for. And since a dead body implies the death of some person, the theory of substitution left us with a death unaccounted for and obviously concealed. That is to say, it raised a strong presumption of the murder of some unknown person. And here it seemed that our data came to an end, that we had no material whatever for forming any hypothesis as to the identity of the person whose dead body we were assuming to have been substituted for that of Septimus Maddock. But while I was thus turning over the possibilities of this cremation case, the Hampstead case continued to lurk in the background of my mind. It was much less hypothetical. There was positive evidence of some weight that a crime had been committed, and the circumstances offered a fully adequate motive for getting rid of Jardine. Thus it was natural that I should raise the question, was it possible that the two cases could be in any way connected? At the first glance, the suggestion looked absolutely wild, but still I considered it at length, and then it looked somewhat less wild. The two cases had this in common, that if a crime had been committed, Jardine was the sole witness. Moreover, the supposition that the two cases were connected and incriminated the same parties greatly intensified the motive for making away with Jardine. But there was another and much stronger point in favor of this view. If we adopted the theory of substitution, it was impossible, on looking at the two cases, to avoid being struck by the very curious converseness of their conditions. In the Hampstead case, we were dealing with a body which had suddenly vanished, no one could say whither. In the Maddock case, we were dealing with a body which had suddenly appeared, no one could say whence. When I reflected on this very striking appearance of relation, it was inevitable that I should ask myself the question, is it conceivable that these two bodies could have been one and the same? That the body which was cremated could have been the body which Jardine saw in the lane? Again, at the first glance, the question looked absurd. The first body was seen by Jardine more than 6 weeks before the alleged death of Maddock, and the body which he saw at the Samways' house was that of a man newly dead, with rigor mortis just beginning. It was, indeed, barely conceivable that the Hampstead body was not actually dead, and that the man might have lingered on alive for 6 weeks. But this suggestion failed to fit the known facts in 2 respects. In the first place, the body which Jardine saw in the lane was, from his description, pretty unmistakably a dead body. And in the second, the sham illness of Maddock and the elaborate, leisurely preparations suggest a complete control of the time factor, which would be absent if those preparations were adjusted to a dying man who might expire at any moment. Rejecting this suggestion, then, the further question arose, is it possible that the body that was seen in the lane could, after an interval of 6 weeks, have been produced in Gayton Street, perfectly fresh, and in a state of incipient rigor mortis? And when the question was thus fairly stated, the answer was obviously in the affirmative. For is it not a matter of common knowledge that the bodies of sheep are habitually brought from New Zealand to London, traversing the whole width of the tropics in the voyage, and are delivered, after an interval of more than 6 weeks, perfectly fresh, and in a state of incipient rigor mortis? The physical possibility was beyond question. But if physically possible, was such preservation practicable? Well, how are the bodies of the sheep preserved? By exposing them continuously to intense cold. And how is that intense cold produced? Roughly speaking, by the volatilization of a liquefied gas ammonia in the case of the sheep. But behold, the very man whom we are suspecting of being the agent in this crime is a man who has command of large quantities of a liquefied gas, and who has hired a mineral water factory for no apparent reason and put the premises to no apparent use. At this point, Jervis brought his fist down with a bang on the arm of his chair. "Idiot," he exclaimed. "Ass, fool, dolt, imbecile that I am, with those cylinders staring me in the face, too. Of course, it was that interval of 6 weeks that brought me up short. And yet I had actually heard Jardine describe the cloud of carbon dioxide snow that fell on his face. Don't you consider me an absolute donkey, Thorndyke?" "Certainly not," replied Thorndyke. "You happen to miss a link, and of course, the chain would not hold. It occurs to us all now and again. But do you see, Jardine, how the stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner? Don't you understand how, when I reached this point, there rose before me the picture of that cellar with the commonplace objects that it contained? The case, 7 feet by 2.5 so convenient for preserving a body in a bulky packing. The 2 waterproof sheets so well adapted to holding a mass of carbon dioxide snow in contact with the body. The mass of straw one of the most perfect non-conductor so admirably fitted for its use as a protective packing for the frozen body. And lastly, those 10 empty cylinders, of which 7 had been used for some purpose unknown to us. Let this case be a lesson to you, Jardine, not only in legal medicine but in clinical medicine, too, to take the facts as you find them relevant or irrelevant, striking or commonplace note them carefully, and trust them to find their own places in the inductive scheme. "It has been a most instructive lesson to me," said I, "especially your analysis of the reasoning by which you identified the criminal." Said Thorndyke, "I didn't know I'd got as far as that." But if the body was preserved in a frozen state, there could not be much doubt as to who had preserved it. "Possibly not," Thorndyke agreed. "But I had not proved that it had been so preserved, but only that it was possible for it to have been, and that the supposition of its having been so preserved was in agreement with the known circumstances of the case. But I must impress on you that up to this point I was dealing in pure hypothesis. My hypothesis was perfectly sound, perfectly consistent in all its parts, and perfectly congruous with all the known facts, but it did not follow therefore that it was true. It was entirely unverified, for hitherto I had not one single item of positive evidence to support it. Nevertheless, the striking agreement between the hypothesis and the known facts encouraged me greatly, and, As it was evident that I had now exhausted the material yielded by the cremation incident, I decided to take up the clue at the other end, to investigate the details of the Hampstead affair. To this end, I called on Jardine, who very kindly went over the case with me afresh. And here it was that I first came within hail of positive evidence. On his wall was pinned an oil sketch, and on that sketch was a distinct print of a right thumb. It was beautifully clear, for the paint, having been dry on the surface but soft underneath, had taken the impression as sharply as a surface of warm wax. Now, you will remember that I took possession of the letter, which summoned Jardine to the mineral water works, and I may now say that I tested it most carefully for fingerprints. But paper is a poor material on which to develop invisible prints owing to its absorbent nature, and I had very indifferent success. Still, I did not fail entirely. By the combined use of lycopodium powder and photography, I obtained impressions of parts of 2 fingertips and a portion of the end of a right thumb. They were wretched prints, but yet available for corroboration, since one could see part of the pattern on each and could make out that the ridge pattern of the thumb was of the kind known as a twinned loop. Bearing this fact in mind, you will understand that I was quite interested to find that the print on the sketch also, that of a right thumb, had a twinned loop pattern. I noted the fact as a coincidence, but of course, attached no importance to it until Jardine told me that the artist who painted the sketch habitually worked in gloves, and even then I merely made a mental note that I would ascertain who and what the artist was. I need not go over our examination of the scene of the crime. I need only say that I was deeply interested in following the track along which the body had been carried, because I was on the lookout for something, and that something was a house or other building in which the body might have been temporarily deposited. My hypothesis seemed to demand such a building, for since the body was quite fresh and rigor mortis was only beginning when Jardine saw it at Gayton Street, it must have been frozen very shortly after death. Now, it obviously could not have been carried from Hampstead to Gayton Street on a man's back. The alternative is either a vehicle waiting at an appointed place and, necessarily, not far away, or a house or other building to which the body could be taken. But the vehicle would, under the circumstances, be almost impracticable. It would hardly be possible to make an appointment with any exactness as to time, and the presence of a waiting or loitering vehicle would, at such an hour, it was about midnight, you will remember, be almost certain to arouse suspicion and inquiry. On the other hand, a house to which the body could be conveyed would meet the conditions perfectly. When once the body was deposited there, the danger of pursuit would be practically at an end, and it would be quite possible to have a supply of the liquid gas ready for use on its arrival. This is assuming long premeditation and very deliberate preparation, an assumption supported by Gill's peculiar tenancy of the factory. I therefore kept a sharp lookout for a likely house or building, and as Jardine and I came out of Kenwood by the turnstile, behold, a house which answered the requirements to perfection. It was a solitary house, there was no other house near, and it lay right on the track along which the body had apparently been carried. Instantly, I decided to investigate the recent history of that house and its tenants, but Jardine saved me the trouble. From him, I learned that, at the time of the assumed murder, it had been inhabited by the artist whom he had mentioned, but that it had now been empty for a week or 2. Here were news indeed. This artist, who habitually wore gloves and whose right thumbprint was a twinned loop, had been living in this house at the time of the assumed murder, but had been living elsewhere at the time of the cremation. It was a striking group of facts, and I eagerly availed myself of the opportunity of looking over the house. At first, the examination was quite barren and disappointing. The man's habits, as shown by the few discarded articles of use or other traces, were of no interest to me and still less to Jardine, and of traces of his personality there were none. I searched all the rejected canvases and every available scrap of paper in the hope of collecting some fresh fingerprints, but without the smallest result. In fact, the examination looked like being an utter failure up to the very last, when we entered the stable loft. But here I came upon 1 or 2 really significant traces of occupation. The first of these was a smooth, indented line on the floor, as if some heavy, metallic object had been dragged along it, with other, rougher lines, apparently made by a heavy wooden case. Then there was a quantity of straw, Not new straw such as you might expect to find in a stable loft, but straw that had evidently been used for packing. And finally, there was a pair of canvas pliers, which appeared to have been strained by a violent effort to rotate from right to left some hard metallic body, 3/4 of an inch wide, with sharp corners and apparently square in section. Some body, in fact, that in shape, in size, and apparently in material, was identical with the square of the cock on one of the liquid gas bottles, which appeared to have been connected with a screw thread and had clearly required great force to turn it with this inadequate appliance. The evidence collected from the loft, suggesting that a large case had been moved in and out and that a gas cylinder had been opened, you will say was of the flimsiest. And so it was. But the effects of evidence are cumulative. To estimate the value of these observations made in the loft, you must add them to the facts just obtained concerning the artist himself, the position of his house, and the date on which he vacated it. And these coincidences and agreements must be added to, more strictly, multiplied into the body of coincidences and agreements which I have already described. But the evidence collected at the house was the least important part of the day's catch. On returning to Jardine's rooms, I ventured to borrow the sketch and took it home with me. And when I compared the thumbprint on it with the photograph of the thumbprint on the letter employing the excellent method of comparison that is in use at Scotland Yard, there could be no possible doubt, disregarding for the moment the chances of forgery, that they were the prints of one and the same thumb. Here then, at last I had stepped out of the region of mere hypothesis. Here was an item of positive evidence, and one, moreover, of high probative value. It proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, the existence of some connection between the house on the Heath and the factory in Norton Street, and it established a strong presumption that the artist and the man at the factory were the same person, the weak point in this being the absence of proof that the thumbprint on the painting was made by the artist. And here, Jardine, I would draw your attention to the interesting way in which, when a long train of hypothetical reasoning has at length elicited an actual, demonstrable truth, that truth instantly reacts on the hypothesis, lifting it as a whole on to an entirely different plane of probability. I may compare the effect to that of a crystal dropped into a supersaturated solution of a salt, such as sodium sulfate. So long as it is at rest, the solution remains a clear liquid, but drop into it the minutest crystal of its own salt, and in a few moments the entire liquid has solidified into a mass of crystals. So it was in the present case. In the instant when it became an established fact that the house at Hampstead and the factory in Norton Street had been occupied by the same person, the entire sequence of events which I had hypothetically constructed sprang from the plane of mere conceivability to that of actual probability. It was now more likely than unlikely that the unknown cleric had been murdered, that his body had been conveyed to the artist's house, that it had there been frozen, transferred to the factory, preserved there for some weeks, passed over the wall to the Samway's house, and finally cremated under the name of Septimus Maddock. All that now remained to be done was the verification and identification of the body. As to the first, I examined the will at Somerset House and found it, as the American detectives suspected, a mere notification to the New York authorities that Septimus Maddock was dead. I wrote to the detective agency, and in due course came O'Donnell with the answers to my questions, from which we learned for certain that the artist was Septimus Maddock, and that the assumed peculiarity of the hands consisted of brachydactylia. And then came the good Father Humperdinck to enable us to give a name to the body, and to furnish us with that unlooked-for means of identification. Henceforward, all was plain sailing with only one possible source of failure, the possibility that the bullet might have been subsequently extracted. But this was highly improbable. We knew that the wound had healed completely, and it was pretty certain that the bullet was lying quietly encysted or embedded in the bone. Still, I will confess that I have never in my life been more relieved than I was when my eyes lighted on that dent in the ilium, with the stain of lead oxide round it. "So I can imagine," said Jervis. "It was a triumph, and you deserved it. I have never known even my revered senior to work out the theory of a crime more neatly or with less positive matter to work from, and I suppose you have a pretty clear and connected idea of the actual sequence of events." "I think so," replied Thorndyke, "although much of it is necessarily conjectural. I take it that Maddock, while hiding in Bruges under the name of Burton, made the acquaintance of Reinhardt, and saw in the rich, friendless, eccentric bachelor a suitable subject for a crime which he had probably already considered in general terms. I should think that they were probably somewhat alike in appearance, and that the idea of personation was first suggested by the circumstance that they both wore gloves habitually. Maddock will have learned of Reinhardt's intended visit to England and immediately begun his preparations. His scheme, and a most ingenious one it was, I must confess, was clearly to cause Reinhardt to disappear in one locality and produce his body after a considerable interval in another at some distance. And the house on the heath was apparently taken with this object, and to be near Reinhardt's haunts. I take it that on the night of the murder, Reinhardt had an appointment to visit him at that house, but that, having learned at Miss Vine's of the sudden illness of brother Bartholomew, he suddenly altered his plans and refused to go. Then Maddock, who had probably waited for him on the road seeing his scheme on the point of being wrecked, walked with him as he was going home and took the risk of killing him in Millfield Lane. The risk was not great, considering the time of night and the solitary character of the place, and the distance from the house was not too great for a strong man, as Maddock seems to have been, to carry the body. Death was almost certainly produced by a stab in the back, and Maddock was probably just about to carry the body away when Destiny, in the form of Jardine, appeared. Then Maddock must have lurked, probably behind the fence which had the large hole in it, until Jardine went away, when he must instantly have picked up the body, carried it down the lane, pushed it over the fence detaching the reliquary as he did so carried it away to the house, stripped it, and proceeded at once to freeze it, having provided a bottle of the gas in readiness. The next morning he will have gone to Marchmont's office, probably dressed in Reinhardt's clothes, from thence to Charing Cross, and with Reinhardt's luggage, gone straight on to Paris, leaving the body packed in an abundance of the carbonic acid snow. At Paris, he will have made his arrangements with Desiree and then disappeared, returning in disguise to England to carry out the rest of the plan. And a wonderfully clever plan it was, and most ingeniously and resolutely executed. If it had succeeded, and it was within a hair's breadth of succeeding, the hunted criminal, Maddock, would have been beyond the reach of justice forever, and the fictitious Reinhardt might have lived out his life in luxury and absolute security. As Thorndyke concluded, he rose from his chair, and, stepping over to a cabinet, drew from some inner recess a cigar of melanotic complexion and repulsive aspect. Jervis looked at it and chuckled. "Thorndyke's one dissipation," said he. "At the close of every successful case he proceeds, as a sort of thanksgiving ceremony, to funk us out of these chambers with the smoke of a Trichinopoly cheroot. But listen, don't light it yet, Thorndyke. Here comes some harmless and inoffensive stranger." Thorndyke paused with the cigar in his fingers. A quick step ascended the stairs, and then came a sharp, official rat-tat from the little brass knocker. Thorndyke laid the cigar on the mantelpiece and strode over to the door. I saw him take in a telegram, open it, glance at the paper, and dismiss the messenger. Then, closing the door, he came back to the fireside with the flimsy in his hand. "There, Jardine," said he, laying it on my knee. "There is your order of release." I picked up the paper and read aloud its curt message. "Maddock arrested, Folkestone now, in custody, Bow Street." "Miller." "That means to say," said Thorndyke, "that the halter is already around his neck. I think I may light my Trichinopoly now." And he did so. There is little more to tell. This has been a history of coincidences, and one more coincidence brings it to a close. The very day on which my formal engagement to Sylvia was made public chanced to be the day on which the execution of Septimus Maddock was described in the papers. On that day, too, the portrait of poor Letitia, painted by that skillful and murderous hand, was placed in the handsome ebony frame that I had caused to be made for it. As I write these closing words, it hangs before me, flanked on either side by the little jar of violets that are renewed religiously from day to day by my wife or me. The pale, inscrutable eyes look out on me, her friend whom she loved so faithfully and who so little merited her love. But as I look into them, the picture fades and shows me the same face glorified, waxen, pallid, drowsy-eyed, peaceful and sweet, the dead face of the woman who gave her heart's blood as the price of my ransom, and who was fated then to pass out of my life indeed, but out of my heart's shrine and my most loving remembrance, never. The end. Transcriber's notes. The edition hosted on Project Gutenberg Australia, publisher, and date not given, was consulted for some of the changes given below. Minor spelling inconsistencies, e.g. footstep, hair's breadth/hair's breadth, inadmissible/inadmissible, runaway, etc., have been preserved. Alterations to the text. Punctuation. Fix some quotation mark pairings nestings, some missing periods and commas, etc. Change 5 instances of the Samway's house to the Samway's house. Which way were you going when you came on the body? Change the period to a question mark. Change quite the orthodox get up to get up. No facial signs, nothing unusual in his color or expression, to color. By Jove, exclaimed Batson, this business has upset to Jove. Camden Town is not a very attractive neighborhood to neighborhood. Her appearance suggested was strength, sheer, muscular strength, delete the last comma. I suppose I can do the surgery work, said I, change the question mark to a comma. And a man named O'Connor confirmed his certificate after examining to O'Connor. And bring in a crowd of beastly reports humming about the place to reporters. The worthy Gill, said Jarvis, seems to have been to Jervis. Letting one's fancy furnish them with one's own household gods to goods. Shut in by these high fences. I heard quick footsteps behind me change the period to a comma. I can tell you much about this man, excepting that he was to that. The next question is, how was the body taken away? Change the period to a question mark. Scope of the acquaintance, on which Miss Vine remarked that delete the comma. As if to inspect the end of the shop window, and Sylvia exclaimed, change the period to a colon. I want to know how you came to be in Folkestone, and in that to Folkestone. I didn't think you had noticed my negligee get up, to get up. Front of the window while a discreet reticence is maintained, delete the comma. By the way, where did you see us? I didn't see you. Change the second question mark to a period. But don't you think it would be simpler, and shadow him? Change the exclamation mark to a question mark. But wouldn't it be simpler to run the Johnny in any case? Change the period to a question mark. And highly corrugated smile, he opened his mouth and spake to spoke. The doctor tells me to take sanctuary for a time with us, to sanctuary. Saw my watch hanging from a nail, with a rating tabled pinned above it to table. And, he continued, as Polton retired with a gratified smile, I am add comma after smile. But our career in the field was not a long one, delete the comma. The habit began when he had some affection of the skin to affliction. Bestowed on Jervis and me a ceremonial bow, and moved towards to ceremonious. And what answers do you suggest to the questions that Marchmont to suggest? What took place in the sacred precincts of my principal's chambers, to precincts? Reasoning, you know, Mr. O'Donnell, he continued, is somewhat change the semicolon to a comma. And, after a few moments' cogitation, turned once more to moments. This villain has a double grime gommeted, he has murdered a goot to villain. Evidently, anticipating the inevitable discussion on the results of delete the second comma. The case, 7 feet by 2.5 so convenient for, to a half.